Good evening, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to the official 2023 Atlantic hurricane season predictions, my preliminary predictions for April. Here it is, my thoughts, what I think about the hurricane season, and everything you need to know from what I believe will occur this season is going to be mentioned in this video. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I have posts to comments if you have any questions, and I also have my Discord, which I'll bring up later. So if you're new and you have any questions for what I think, and also if you do know me but you still have questions, I'll bring those up later. But for now, let's get started right away, shall we? We have a lot to go over, and we shouldn't waste any time. I'm going over anything. So here it is. First of all, in order to go over this year, what we think this year might happen, it's always important to review what occurred last year. And in a year in review last year, we had 14 named storms, 8 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes. We all remember last year as the year that everybody was hyping up to be really, really active, but of course fell short of that. But we still had our fair share of activity, two U.S. hurricane landfalls, and an ACE index of 95 points. ACE, the output energy of tropical cyclones when they develop, and of course, of those 2 U.S. landfalling storms, we had Hurricane Ian, which made landfall in Fort Myers in Florida. So despite last year not being as active, it was still very much a bad year, which is why, you can't always let your guard down even if years are not as active as they're supposed to be. But with that being said, we reviewed last year. What do we look for, though, for an Atlantic hurricane season in general? Here are some factors that we're going to go over. I do have a bonus factor, which I'll mention a little bit later on once we go over all these. But here's some of the most important factors in an Atlantic season. That includes the SSTAs, specifically in the Atlantic, because that plays a huge factor because it's the Atlantic basin, and the SSTs, the sea surface temperatures, that's the actual name that we call it. Sea surface temperature anomalies, that's what the A stands for too. Departures from normal of the sea surface temperatures. That's what matters, of course, because it shows how warm or cold the sea surface temperatures are, which is ultimately the biggest factor, especially when it comes to development of tropical cyclones. Then we have ENSO, El Nino, or La Nina. That's also That's also a very big factor because ENSO, has global implications on global patterns as well. So that also affects the Atlantic and wind shear, and these two are very much correlated with each other quite a bit of the time, I should say. And so usually, for instance, in La Nina, we'll go over what these terms mean a little bit more later on, but just to give a hindsight how they relate, for instance, in an ENSO with the La Nina, we tend to have less wind shear, which favors more Atlantic hurricanes, while in El Nino, it's the opposite. We have higher wind shear, and that obviously favors less hurricane development. And then the last one, we have MJO. That is also related to ENSO, since ENSO, once again, does have global implications on patterns across the entire globe. So there's that. Let's take a look at the first factor, and that is Atlantic SSTAs. Looking at the Atlantic, and as I did mention, and I've been mentioning for the past few weeks, the Atlantic remaining very, very warm basically looks like a hot tub. As I said in my discussion a few days ago, if you remember that, I said the Atlantic looks like a hot tub, and it really does, because look at all these anomalies, as much as 1 and even 2 degrees Celsius above normal, from the normal in some cases. And I'll show you in a little bit, this area has a huge correlation sometimes with very active hurricane seasons, of course, if it wouldn't be for El Nino or ENSO or other factors that we're going to talk about later on. But also, I also mentioned quite often, the Gulf of Mexico is very warm. That'll have an interesting impact, especially on storms that develop closer to land, which we've been having a lot more in recent years. Also a very interesting thing to keep note of. And then, of course, off the U.S. East Coast and near Florida too. And I'll mention Florida a little bit more in a little bit more later, but just keep in mind, Florida SST temperatures right now, right near the coast of Florida, have been warm the entire winter, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic in general as well. And then we have ENSO, which is this area, and generally the entire Pacific. And now I'm thinking I should have brought up that ENSO map, which maps where the ENSO regions are, but generally I could outline for you right around here is where we watch for ENSO the most, El Nino Southern Oscillation. This is where we monitor where El Nino or La Nina is taking place. And of course, this year, if you're on top of things, and if not, I'll go over it, of course, a little bit later on, but we're expecting more of an El Nino. But right now, in a neutral pattern, a warmish neutral pattern, warmer than normal anomalies beginning to fill up the equatorial region, and of course, should bring us a little bit closer towards the El Nino later on in the season. And then we have all these maps, as I did mention. El Nino is very much expected. Some models, as much as the CFS, very confident in El Nino, so much so that they're going with stretches to all the way Super Nino territory, basically on par for the strongest Nino we've ever seen is what the CFS is going for. I kind of doubt it, but that's what the CFS has. It is a climate model after all, so it does know more than me, I guess. Sometimes it does has its mistakes, keep that in mind, but CFS very, very potent on El Nino. And of course, as I did mention as well in my discussion a few days ago, the CPC, the ENSO probabilities from the Climate Prediction Center, also is very confident in El Nino, with up to almost a 90% chance by the time we get to the end of the year that will be in El Nino territory in the ENSO. So it's very, very confident that El Nino might be one of the factors we're watching for this year. And this is also playing a factor, as I mentioned, into wind shear. And typically, when an El Nino is in place, that means, by the way, El Nino warmer waters, as mentioned here, actually on the graph, warmer and wet, basically warmer SST temperatures, warmer atmospheric temperatures along the equatorial region. This allows for rising motion in the Pacific, and we're going to go over MJO and how that relates. That pertains to rising motion. We'll go over that in just a little bit. But generally, this allows for more hurricane development in the Pacific, and in turn, fewer hurricanes due to stronger vertical wind shear and trade winds and greater atmospheric stability. That also pertains to rising motion in MJO. That we'll also go over in just a little bit as well. And we talked about just not long ago on the flip side with La Nina, it's cooler. We have cooler sea surface temperature anomalies and sea surface temperatures out along the equatorial Pacific. That leads to fewer hurricanes in the Pacific, and in turn, as you would expect, more hurricane development, or a greater chance for more development in the Atlantic, because things are more atmospherically favorable for that. Now we talk about MJO, the most active hurricane seasons, which is what typically happens in a La Nina. Something we do that I did mention before, of course, La Nina has colder sea surface temperature anomalies across the Pacific. And of course, with that too, you see this is a general map of how the MJO works with La Nina conditions. You notice these big arrows, that represents the atmosphere is sinking in motion, sinking air in the atmosphere. And when we think of the development of thunderstorms, we all know that thunderstorms, they like to rise upwards. The air in thunderstorms rise upwards, and that creates instability in the atmosphere. And in La Nina, we don't have that in the Pacific, and because we don't have that in the Pacific, that allows for the Atlantic to take control, and in turn we have warmer sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, and as well as more rising motion as well. And of course, El Nino is the opposite, more rising motion in the Pacific, warmer sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific, rising motion there, more MJO focused activity there, that allows for more hurricane development, and of course has the opposite effect in the Atlantic, where the area, the motion in the atmosphere is sinking. So you see the correlation between these events. They all have some sort of correlation with each other, which is a very important factor, and of course something to think about when it comes to predicting these hurricane seasons. Another factor that I did want to mention, but honestly this is more or less a bonus factor, but I did not want to take too much time putting this together because I was running short on time, I will say. My fault, but at least I got the prediction video out, at least. Factor 5, the SOI index, and this has direct correlations with the ENSO because this records the trade value, the pressure pattern across the Pacific, and that has directly influence on the ENSO because, as I mentioned earlier, ENSO has direct implications on atmospheric patterns across the Pacific. And I'm not going to take way too much time describing this, but generally what you're looking for is in the negative range. That's when it's representative that the atmosphere is behaving more or less in a way that's favorable for El Nino. And in the positive range of the SOI, the atmosphere is more or less favoring the development of La Nina, or behaving more atmospherically in favor of La Nina, and that's what we typically have. And this is a map of the last 30 days with the SOI. SOI, of course, in the negative range in the 30-day average, because of course, over the last 30 days, we've been trending a lot more towards El Nino. If you've been hearing a lot about these westerly wind bursts in the Pacific, helping warm up the Pacific and move us away from the La Nina that we were earlier in the year. If you remember that we were in a La Nina earlier in the year. And that's also still reflective on the 90-day average, even though we were still in late March last month, we were in a positive SOI territory, and we're still in a positive SOI territory, but much more in a strongly positive range, because atmospherically we were still getting away and transitioning away from La Nina effects. Now we're still in a positive and solidly positive SOI, but as you did notice over the last month or so, it has begun to tank as a result of conditions more or less changing and favoring El Nino, like most of us have been forecast. But I will mention that over the last few weeks, notice that it did flatline a little bit, the development of this, and that's one important factor to keep in mind, is how this all favors in development of whether or not El Nino comes quick enough to have significant impacts on the season. It all depends on exactly what happens with that. But that's one important thing to keep in mind. And the SOI is especially a tool to really look for in the off season more than on the on season, because the off season we kind of get more of an idea of the atmospheric behavior when it comes to long range ENSO. So that's more of a tool that we like to look at in the off season per se. Now we go on to what makes an active hurricane season, with all the factors that we just went over that we usually watch for. And I always have a table every single year. I always make a table for, what typically makes an active season, what typically doesn't, and this year is no exception. An active season, we have warmer than normal SSTAs, and you can kind of put that a check on that. Rising motion in the Atlantic, we'll have to see, but actually climate model is very interesting that they do show some sort of rising motion cell in the Atlantic, even though we are expecting an El Nino. And if you look in the inactive column, El Nino most of the time is more or less associated with less active hurricane seasons because of the atmospheric implications El Nino has on the Atlantic. But of course there are some exceptions, like 2013. That year did not have an El Nino at all. A lot of people, I feel like sometimes when they realize that 2013 was not El Nino, were surprised, but 2013 was actually neutral, and 2013 as well as last year was forecasted to be really active. Both years ended up failing, but I will still say there is a difference between last year and 2013. Last year, of course, we still had impacts and we still had, some decent storms, while of course compared to 2013 that wasn't really the case at all. But also on the idea that El Nino, that not as active hurricane seasons are always associated with El Nino. Last year was La Nina, third-year La Nina, and we still ended up having a not as active hurricane season. Higher wind shear, that's also a factor, and usually in inactive seasons because of El Nino, and more dry air as well because of more stable air in the atmosphere, which is what we typically see in El Nino as well. And lower dry air levels is usually what favors an active season because, of course, more instability, and of course low wind shear as well is what favors an active season because hurricanes typically do not develop well with wind shear. And if you're tracking hurricanes long enough, we definitely know that by now. But of course, for those who don't, there you have it. That low wind shear usually is what we look for when it comes to the development of hurricane activity. Now, let's go on to the comparisons that we have compared to this year. What are we expecting, and compared to previous years to kind of give us an idea, of what to expect. This is in the upper left-hand corner. This is this year, 2023. And one thing I did mention, the Atlantic is very warm, and I decided to compare the most recent active years that also had very warm MDRs, some of which note 2020, if you remember that. Of course, we all do. 30 named storms. That year was very active. we ended up having a very warm MDR that got a lot of people talking about and a lot of people eye-opened for the season, especially because the MDR was very warm. But honestly, if you compare it to this year, especially when it comes to the Canary Current, that area that where the correlation really lies, this early on in the year, April, far away from the peak that we still are, that this year seems to be quite a bit warmer. And even compared to years like 2017 as well, we're also much warmer compared to then. 2017 was another very active year. We ended up getting much of a warmer MDR later on, but we, of course, remember 2017, very high ACE, Harvey, Irma, Maria. That was 2017, and then there was 05, the infamous 05, very warm MDR too. Maybe not as much in the similar configuration as we have to this year. This year's a lot more based by the Canaries and off the coast of Africa, but still very warm in both of these years, and also in 2020 as well. But I just decided to bring this up because I did want to show that this year was in par with its warmth in the Atlantic quite a bit to some of the most active hurricane seasons we've had in recent years, and did want to mention this too. Though, since we are expecting an El Nino, these are years that we've had El Ninos or similar setups to leading into El Ninos that we are expecting this year. Some years like 2002, 2009, and 1997, some important years that are very similar in El Nino progression. We're coming out of La Ninas or coming out of neutrals, and we're going into La Ninas. And one thing of note, 2009, this is 2009, not as cold as the MDR as we have this year, not as warm as the MDR, not nearly as much so. In fact, much colder off the coast of Africa, below normal. And this year we're the exact opposite. 2002 as well, not nearly as favorable as the configuration in the Atlantic as we had as well. But of course there was 1997. That year did actually have an interestingly favorable configuration off the Canary Current, which is more resemblance of an active hurricane season. But of course we did have the Super Nino, which in total ended up ultimately shutting down the 1997 season after all, since of course it was a very strong El Nino. So very interestingly enough, comparisons from 2023 to 1997, but you notice this year much warmer indeed. And I did mention there's a correlation with the Atlantic SSTAs in April to ACE, high ACE in the Atlantic, and this is as per Philip Klotzbach. He's the one that brought up this, especially in his recent forecast from a few days ago. He brought up this graphic, but of course, even before then, he brought it up as well, and I thought it's very interesting because it really puts into perspective. Notice where the highest correlation is with warm SSTAs. They're right by the Canary Current and right off the northern coast of Africa. And if we look back, let's go back a little bit to kind of get a close-up view of the Atlantic. Notice those exact areas fit in very well with the correlation to a to high ACE and much more activity in the Atlantic. So there's a correlation with activity in the Atlantic, and we certainly do have that this year, which is something that's kind of making a lot of us really think what we're going to have this year. But I have my idea, and I'll present it to you, of course, in the upcoming minutes. Of course, we'll just have to wait and see. But once again, going over Atlantic SSTA versus active seasons. This time, though, we're actually going over a larger data set of all of the most recent very active seasons of ACE that reached above 150 something, I believe, 160 or so. These are all years, I believe, that have reached ACE above 160, if I'm correct. And notice how this year we have a very warm Eastern Atlantic, very warm off the Canary Current and off the coast of Africa. And notice how that does correlate pretty well and does match up pretty well with the very active hurricane seasons of the past several decades, since of course the start of this very warm positive AMO, as we like to call it, basically meaning the era of warmer than normal SST anomalies in the Atlantic. Basically that's been the case since 1995 in general, and all the most active seasons since then. I do say at least in the Eastern Atlantic, we do share a good amount of course, correlation in SST configuration to there. But of course, there's a little bit of a difference. The Caribbean is not as warm this year. Although, I did do notice, at least in the last few years, the Caribbean is usually not as warm this time of year, but it does end up warming a lot later in the year, come August and September, probably in part due to the West African monsoon that usually comes alive around then and kind of warms everything up. Then, especially in the last few years, if you remember, the Atlantic in May or June would not be as warm, but by the time we got to August and September, the Atlantic would start to warm dramatically, and with it comes the MDR and the Caribbean. So maybe that's not as much of a concern this year. As I did mention anyway, most of the correlation with the SST temperatures usually lies in the Eastern Atlantic. So that's something to keep in mind. And this year, I would say, does match up in that aspect pretty well with active seasons. And then you compare that to inactive seasons, you do see we don't match up as well. Obviously, much colder sea surface temperature anomalies, especially off the coast of Africa. One thing that is similar, though, I will mention, and I'm not really sure if this is that much of a concern, because we've had this basically ongoing situation of warmer sea surface temperature anomalies off the East Coast. No matter what year, it's been like that for the last few years, but warmer sea surface temperature anomalies off the East Coast. But notice out here in the Atlantic, we are much warmer and we're much more in a state that if you compare that to the active seasons, I would say that we correlate a lot more with the active seasons than we do with the inactive seasons. And by the way, most of these years also being similar ENSO years to this year, where we're transitioning into an El Nino in some of these years, quite potent El Ninos. Like a lot of the models are very confident in that occurring this year. And we do have a little bit of a different setup in the Atlantic, so that is something very interesting to mention. MJO as well, another very important factor when it comes to Atlantic development. And of course, MJO, we have a lot of that in the Pacific this year, at least for the August, September, October time period. This is the CFS forecast. And the CANCIPS, this is the Canadian model climate forecast. And then this is the European. This is as of credited from Ben Knoll. I must give him credit because he does put together this graphic. And I do believe it's very cool, but he does show the European MJO forecast. And of course, one thing we do notice, very similar. Obviously, all of them are showing very much rising air, these green, represented by these greens in all these models. That is representative of a favorable MJO, rising air, all centered and concentrated in the Pacific, which, as we talked about earlier, is most favorable for El Nino development. So that is that. And of course, when we look in the most recent active years, most of those years do not have that, because El Nino does, of course, as we did mention before, does tend to cut down on Atlantic activity because of how the atmosphere is set up. And of course, in those active years, we have more MJO focused over in the Atlantic. But I did mention, though, the interests of the warm Atlantic kind of centering some sort of MJO cell over there. And very interestingly enough, the European does actually have a noticeable MJO cell, a rising cell of rising air in the Atlantic, in the European forecast by September. Maybe I would assume that this is kind of in association with the very warm sea surface temperature anomalies there. And if I were to make an estimate, educated guess off of that, I would assume that the very warm sea surface temperature anomalies that we have now in the Atlantic, I'm pretty sure that that is expected to possibly continue at least through the hurricane season. So that'll have a very interesting impact on how this all interacts, because you do remember sometimes, as I did mention in some years before, that sometimes when we do have these years where the Pacific is warm at the same time that the Atlantic is warm, those two do try to tend to compete with each other. And sometimes in those type of years, if the Atlantic holds on long enough, especially with how warm the Atlantic is right now, we do sometimes tend to see the Atlantic win out. And those years when the Atlantic does end up winning out, sometimes we do have some really active hurricane seasons. And then I'll mention one of those seasons in just a little bit. But that's a look at the most recent active years. And of course, because we're expecting an El Nino, and we know El Ninos kind of tend to favor more Pacific activity and less Atlantic activity, it is obviously not unexpected that we do notice more rising motion in the Pacific centered over there instead of the Atlantic. But of course, one thing missing from this picture is the European, which is forecasting more MJO over the Atlantic. Then, of course, we do see in correlation to inactive years, at least from the past few years within the decade that we've been of active hurricane seasons and a warmer Atlantic. So that is something very interesting to mention as well. But of course, when it comes to wind shear, since we are expecting El Nino after all, the general consensus is higher than normal wind shear across the deep tropics. CFS though, and I will mention this as I did mention before earlier on, if you remember I mentioned warm anomalies in the Gulf of Mexico and near Florida. The CFS actually does show and has been consistently showing the idea of potentially warmer of more or less lower wind shear closer to home, and potentially, since especially when we bring into the fact that we've had a lot of close rapid intensification development closer to home. For instance, Ian last year, and we also remember Ida from the year before, and Laura as well from the year before that. Would not be surprising, especially with these warm SST anomalies. Maybe we'll have to watch closer to home this year, especially since the deep tropics will be shut down, or more or less likely to be shut down, since El Nino does tend to shut down those areas, but not always does it shut down closer to home, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. If I not already mentioned, the Gulf of Mexico does not really correlate as much with hurricane seasons. Usually the Gulf of Mexico is something on its own, and almost always in the Gulf of Mexico will there always be favorable conditions no matter the year. So that is something to mention as well. The Cancer still showing a little bit higher wind shear in that aspect, but generally, if we look at these years, both of these models, they generally do have the same aspect, of course, showing the impacts of El Nino. This is something interesting though. The ridging pattern, this is what is very interesting, because the last few years we've had a very strong ridge pattern over North America and over the Northeast, and in the Atlantic, the Maritimes, the Canadian Maritimes, a much stronger ridge, which has allowed many storms and has kind of been associated with why many storms have really been much closer to the coast, and we've had a lot more major hurricane landfalls in the last few years. And we do notice this year there is quite a bit of a lack of that strong ridge over the Canadian Maritimes this year. Also something associated with an El Nino more or less, but we still have had years where there have been bad impacts on Florida, and I'll actually mention a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. But Florida sometimes does tend to have a history with El Nino, or at least sometimes almost El Nino years, if you know what I'm talking about. But sometimes Florida does tend to have a history, and that is something to keep in mind, that do not always keep yourself off guard even during inactive seasons, and that of course should be a lesson from last year. And of course, as we did talk about that, the most active landfall years, especially from the last few years, some most notable ones being 2017, 2020, 2021. That was only as of the last 6 years or so. But if we extend that all the way to the beginning of the active era, the most active years since then, 2008, 2005, and 2004 included, I did mention, of course, we tend to have a lot more of an average stronger ridge over the Canadian Maritimes and northeastern United States, including portions of southeastern Canada, and that's what really allows storms to move closer to the United States. And of course, if we compare that to what the models forecast, we don't have that as much of this year. So maybe we'll see a lot more in the way of recurring landfalls, recurring storms, but of course that'll kind of, at least with this setup, what I believe will occur will kind of alter the areas that we're going to see impacts just a little bit, but still, I'm expecting impacts, and of course, I'll mention in a little bit what I do think those areas will be. But this was really kind of difficult in a way because there were some years that I did want to bring up. For instance, 2017, I did actually want to bring up 2017 in these analogs, but the difference between this year and 2017 is, number one, I guess you could say the Atlantic is much warmer, but number two, even though if we go back to this year compared to 2017, the Eastern Pacific and off the coast of South America were very similar in that aspect with a very warm South American Nino 1-2 regions. 2017 ultimately ended up being a La Nina, and most of the model consensus is expecting this year to be a very solid El Nino, if potentially even a strong El Nino, though I still have my doubts about that. But of course, if you want to mention it, 2017 did in fact predict El Nino by most of the climate models, but of course, by the time we got to May and June, that ultimately backed off and of course resulted in the very active hurricane season that we ended up having that year. So 2017 I did decide to keep off the list, even though I was debating on whether or not I should bring it in. But at least for that aspect, I do have 2004, because 2004, if you are not aware, did actually have an El Nino. And I know some of you are going to come after me in the comments saying 2004 was a Modoki Nino, but 2004, Modoki or not, was still El Nino. And some will argue it was cooler in the Eastern Pacific because of the Modoki situation, but 2004 was still El Nino. And 1969, a lot of people do not know of 1969 because it goes really all the way back. But 1969, that year was also El Nino in the Pacific and a very active year in the Atlantic. We had 12 hurricanes that year and 18 named storms. And that year was not a Modoki, it was a traditional El Nino. I should have brought a graphic up to show that, but 1969 is actually a traditional El Nino, traditional with a warm Eastern Pacific and a warm Central Pacific, and we still ended up having a very active year. And the year previous to 1969, 1968, we had a moderate El Nino. So that is something very interesting, I thought, 1969, and of course 2006 as well, because 2006 we're coming off La Nina 2005, but 2006 also did have a relatively warmer MDR compared to average, so that is something very important to mention. And then of course there's 1997, which was also warmer in the Atlantic region, but of course we had that Super Nino, which ultimately ended up shutting down the Atlantic. And then there's 2009 though as well, which is coming off La Nina, and of course I put that at the bottom of the list because we didn't have as warm of an MDR. In fact, we did have quite of a colder, especially earlier on, a colder MDR that year than we have in most of these other years that we're comparing. So 2009 is at the bottom of the list. But of course, all of these do have some similarities enough that I did bring them on, and because of that, I averaged my predictions in total and decided I would come up with saying, here it is, the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season forecast. I came up with all these numbers. I looked at these last years, these couple of years that I, of course, picked out as my top analogs. Of course, took into a fact that we are in a little bit more of an active phase, especially when it comes to landfalls in the Atlantic. So I factored that in as well. So I'm saying, especially with the fact that we have that, and also, of course, a very warm Atlantic this year, really warmer than most of these years, including 2004 that I've had for my top analogs. I say that we'll probably see anywhere from slightly below near normal season 2 if things go right, and the Atlantic it does end up of course winning out in this fight against who will take dominance over the MJO, of course with each basin, the Pacific and the Atlantic, both being warm. if the Atlantic does win out, I do believe this year could have the potential to be very active. And if you do look at Philip Klotzbach's forecast, he does mention that this year, because of that as well, there's quite a bit of a range of options as to what could occur this year. So that's something that I reflected in my forecast this year. 13 to 18 named storms, 6 to 9 hurricanes, 2 to 5 being major hurricanes this year. And of course, I do believe 3 to 5 total USA landfalls. This includes named storms as well. 3 to 5, kind of similar to last year, not as active as the years prior, but I still believe will have impacts there as well. And what type of impacts I believe? You see in this graphic right here. First of all, some things to note. Recurvers more likely, because I did mention lack of ridging over the northern United States and the Canadian Maritime. So probably we'll see more early recurvers, but I do believe that even with that, take into account that we are in a very active era for landfalls. Won't be surprised if the storms that do get further west will threaten the Northern Islands, Bahamas, and the Florida East Coast. You can judge me on whether or not this is true, but I honestly do believe, and I do have a suspicion, Nicole is indeed kind of foreshadowing the Florida East Coast this year, or at least Florida in general. I'd honestly say the next year or two. Something about it, I don't know. Nicole, the way Nicole occurred last year, the way she occurred last year, I honestly find it interesting. So wouldn't really rule out the east coast of Florida as well. And of course, as I mentioned, Florida does sometimes have an interesting history in warmer years. In 2018, there was Michael. There was 1992, which was post strong El Nino the previous year, or moderate one. I don't remember, but it was some sort of decent El Nino that occurred the previous year. We ended up having Andrew the year after, even though generally the 1992 season was very inactive. And then there was 2019, which was a borderline El Nino, came off the weak El Nino from 2018. We saw Dorian come very, very close to the east coast of Florida. And then, of course, and again, I don't know if this is true. I really got to go fact check this, because I don't want to, be out here, giving y'all misinformation. But I do believe the 1935 hurricane season, at least with the data that we have right now, there were indications that the 1935 season did in fact have an El Nino as well that year. And of course, interesting to mention as well, the 1969 hurricane season was an El Nino, and that year also had a Category 5 landfall, as well as the 1935, 2008, and 2018 and 1992 seasons as well, which I did all mention before. See a pattern here? Sometimes these El Nino warmer years, or sometimes not as active years, or years that are different from the typical very active, high impact U.S. years that are more like 2017 to 2020, 2005. You get the idea. Those years sometimes do tend to be very interesting for the United States, and I did mention that here. And I do believe this will be something to watch in the late season, though. Even though I did say chances for El Nino to develop at some point, especially because of climate models, there's a very likely chance. There's a very likely chance, of course, El Nino will develop at some point this year, and it'll probably temper late season chances the most, in my opinion, out of the entire season. More early recurvers are likely to develop this year because of a general pattern change associated in alignment with El Nino. So storms that do develop out in the MDR, and I do believe that there will be development in the MDR because of the warm Atlantic. So I will tell you guys, actually do watch out for potentially more development to occur out in the Atlantic, the MDR this year. I do believe that is a potential. That should potentially threaten the Northern Islands, though, storms that do come close. Bermuda, Bahamas, east coast of Florida, and of course the Northern Islands, and of course the east coast of Florida and the west coast of Florida too, and that should potentially come for the late season, the Northwestern Caribbean. And I do believe that development could be similar to Nate and Michael. Just saying, I did see indications that, at least from some climate models, the precipitation in the Gulf of Mexico, at least when it gets to October, is looking pretty interesting. So I do want to mention that, and of course, some of these years, whether it's late season or not, do tend to have sometimes interesting Gulf of Mexico developments at some point during the hurricane season, particularly in the eastern central Gulf, right around the area of Michael. Storms like Michael, Ivan, Nate, Ian of last year are. So that is something interesting to keep in mind. And of course, I do believe, because of the fact that the Caribbean, most likely, since we're expecting El Nino, Caribbean will likely struggle for most of the year and probably not fire as much as we've seen in the last few years, and that should probably keep the threat for places like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and of course the Bay of Campeche and the Western Gulf. More or less likely, I do believe those areas will be out of it, as well as the southern islands. And of course, generally with climatology, the northern United States tends to have less likely chances for landfalls. I mean, if you do look back at the most active northeast years that we've had in the past, we generally tend to see those years occur in La Nina. So I'm not really as much concerned about the northern U.S. this year compared to the last few years, but the southeast, and especially Florida and near the islands, I believe will be something interesting. And something new I did add this year, I do have a breakdown of what I do believe will occur throughout the year. This is my breakdown of what I believe the season will generally be like and how the season generally might play out. I believe June will probably see generally modest activity, 1 to 2 named storms. July, 1 to 3. And I will mention this, sometimes when it comes to these very warm Atlantics, sometimes especially these very warm Atlantics do tend to help with early season development. And I will mention this, 1997, even though was a very inactive season as a whole, even though we had a developing El Nino, there was a lot of early season activity. So that's something I'm factoring into my predictions. Generally, June, 1 to 2 named storms. July, 1 to 3. And then August and September, 4 to 5, 3 to 5 in August, 4 to 5 in September. Generally expecting an active August and September, especially out here in the eastern Atlantic, and of course in the southwestern Atlantic as well, threatening the southeastern U.S. and of course generally the islands, as I did mention. And of course, because of the effects of El Nino, won't be surprised if we do see some sort of taper off with less activity in the late season. So generally that is what I'm saying for this season. But of course, with that being said, even though we might not have as much of an active season this year because of El Nino, depends on what happens though. Depends on if El Nino is strong enough to entirely suppress the Atlantic, even if it's warm, or the Atlantic is able to win out. Of course, it all depends. It is always important to be prepared. And we should have taken that lesson from last year. I really do believe last year we should have taken the lesson to be prepared. Hurricane preparedness week this year, is April 30th to May 6th. And I will make a video a little bit later on, I believe in a few weeks or so, or at least during Hurricane Preparedness Week. I will make a video on a little bit more on how to prepare for hurricanes and for hurricane season. That includes buy supplies, put together a first aid kit well in advance so you're prepared. Make sure you have a battery powered radio so just in case power goes out you can listen to local information just in case you are actually being impacted by a storm. Check insurance because there was a major issue with insurance last year pertaining to Ian. A lot of people lost houses and they were not being insured. I believe something along the lines with that last year with Ian. So make sure you're checking your insurance as well, so you're able to recover, just in case there, of course, is any damage to a storm if it does impact your area. And very importantly, remember your zone of evacuation for when it's time to evacuate. So when they call your zone, you know you are ready to leave just in case a storm is striking you. Really quickly, the names for this year. if you do notice, and I do find it kind of funny that a lot of people have a superstition about this year because we are using the same lists that we've used in 2017 and of course 2005 as well. And that's the same list we're using this year. We have Arlene as the first name, and of course we have from 2017 four new names on the list, that being Harold, Adalia, Margaret, and Nigel, all replacing, of course, Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Nate, which were all retired in 2017. So that is something. And then we have the Eastern Pacific this year. The first name on the list is Adrienne. And then, of course, we're on list one when it comes to Central Pac activity, Central Pacific activity. So that is that. With the names, that's a look at the names for this year. And as I did say, if you do have any questions, please go ahead, comment in the comments in YouTube what you believe, any questions. And of course, share your own predictions as well. Share your thoughts about my video. If you did not like it, mention that, what I could improve upon, what you think I made a mistake, or if you did like anything that I did and you want to mention that, of course, bring that to my attention in the YouTube comments. And of course, would really appreciate it too if you subscribe to my page on YouTube, get the notification bell as well. And also, not only YouTube is a place to post comments about what you believe on my work, but Discord as well. This is my Discord tag. Don't judge my name, please. But this is my Discord tag. So if you have any questions on Discord, you can message me there as well. Send me a friend request. I'll of course accept it if you of course are willing to be nice. If not, I'm not going to accept it, but hey, that's just how it is. But with that being said, I do appreciate you guys for, of course, staying around. Let me know what you think. And all I'm going to have to say to you guys is really watch what occurs this year between the battle between El Nino and the warm MDR. It's a very complicated situation. A lot of people are mentioning that the setup this year is very complicated. It's definitely an interesting one. And whatever happens this year, always be prepared. Because no matter what, we could still have a bad season, even if it means it's just one storm. All it takes is just one. So that's something very important to mention as well. But thanks for tuning in to this discussion. And I did mention, and I did forget, I was gonna put a page on it on my Google Slides, but I ended up not, because I was kind of rushing this to be able to post this video because I was short on time. But if you're looking for any more predictions after this, here are dates to remember. June 1st, that's when my official forecast for the season will come out. My official forecast for the season, because this was the preliminary forecast. This was an official forecast by me, but it's preliminary. It's April. June 1st. If you remember, if you've been with me long enough, you know every single year I do day one live streams on June 1st, marking the start of the hurricane season. I'll be releasing my next prediction then, based on anything that does change between now and June, and my final mid-season update forecast, tweaking any numbers that does, of course, pertain to any changes that does occur during the early part of the season. I will add that to my forecast that'll come out August 1st. I believe it'll probably be in a live stream as well. Gotta see, but generally expect a forecast from me as well, June 1st and August 1st when I release my last prediction. Then, of course, it'll also be the start of August and the start of the peak season as well. But with that being said, that's all I have to say for now. And of course, if you did enjoy, and actually, let's kind of end this on a nice note. Let's start on the homepage. If you did enjoy what you saw today, of course, please like, subscribe, share your comments below, and let me know what you think. And with that being said, enjoy your evening, and we'll see you for our discussion this Saturday, where we'll, of course, talk again about typical hurricane stuff, as we always do. Till then, stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to all. We'll talk again later.